Welcome to my refrigerator. This is Megan Martins Hayworth, your host for Art Fridge Art History. Today we're going to be taking a look at A Sunday on La Grande Jatte by Georges Seurat. Welcome to the fourth episode of Art Fridge Art History with Megan Martins Hayworth. Today we're going to talk about A Sunday on La Grande Jatte by Georges Seurat. Here's our painting. It's a very famous one. You've probably seen it at some point or another in reproduction, maybe even in person. It's A Sunday on La Grande Jatte by Georges Seurat, a French artist, and this was done between the years of 1884 to 1886. It's an oil on canvas painting measuring a whopping 6 feet 9 inches by 10 feet. If you want to see it, you'll have to go to Chicago. It's at the Art Institute of Chicago, and it's one of their main attractions. Today we're going to talk about this painting and the artist, and a little bit about this type of painting. This is Georges Seurat. This portrait was taken of him in 1888. Seurat was from a modest background. His dad was a bureaucrat that worked as a customs officer, but his family supported his interest in art, and he would go on to study for a year and a half at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He quit for a year for military service, but would return to painting afterwards, and he quickly became fascinated by color and how it works in a painting. One of his favorite artists while he was at school was Delacroix, a famous colorist. This painting took 2 years to plan and paint, which was kind of unheard of during the reign of Impressionism, where everything was done spontaneously and quickly. So why did it take him 2 years to plan and create this painting? It comes down to numbers: 28, 24, and 3. And those numbers are significant because he did 28 preparatory studies, mostly in charcoal, for the painting. He did 24 smaller oil studies, which he did outside, which is called en plein air. He would go to the site and do these little oil studies. And then he actually did 3 other larger canvases of the same subject to explore different compositions and experiment with the colors. And that comes to the color science part. He was also super interested in color science, and he approached his painting like a laboratory. Let's take a quick look at some of those preparatory drawings because I particularly love them. He did these beautiful charcoal drawings on this really rough paper. And what I love about the drawings is not only are they kind of elegant, but they also have this kind of grainy quality that we also see in the painting. I think he chose that paper for a reason. He did numerous figure studies and animal studies. Almost every figure had some kind of drawing of it, where he'd work on the proportions, the dress, the pose. You can see some of these here. This is one of my favorites because I love the dog, but it shows how deep the space actually looks without all the figures in it, right? And so he was doing all these drawings, which takes a long time. Unlike the Impressionists, who would often take their canvases outside and paint en plein air, Seurat painted his in a studio from drawings and from his oil studies. Another reason this painting took so long is because of his interest in color theory. These 2 men, chemist Michel-Eugène Chevreul and physicist from America Ogden Rood, would write long essays on scientific discoveries and ideas surrounding color and color theory. Most artists had a basic and rudimentary understanding of color. For instance, they might know the primary and secondary colors, and they might understand what the complementary colors are. But really, this is a time of science, and so these people started looking at how colors actually work and are perceived by our eye. And this was really fascinating for Seurat. One of the things that Seurat worked on was this idea of simultaneous contrast of hues, which explored how neighboring colors affect one another. For example, a light blue placed next to a dark blue looks lighter than it actually is, and the same is true of the dark blue placed next to a light blue. It appears darker. So it explored the idea of a color and how it's affected by what's beside it. For instance, in this color swatch that you're kind of looking at, the light blue strip is the same blue color in both sides. Yet, depending on the color around it, it really changes how that color looks. And so that was one of the things that Seurat was looking at, how the eye perceives those differences and how other colors affect each other, right? Another thing that these scientists of the day were looking at was really beautifully illustrated in one of my favorite 80s films, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, made in 1986. This is a film still from probably one of my most favorite scenes in the movie, where the trio has visited the Chicago Institute of Art Museum, and Cameron is standing in front of La Grande Jatte, and it is a sequence that is very brilliant because it'll show Cameron's face and then it'll show the painting. And each time they pan back and forth between Cameron's face and the painting, we are closer and closer and closer to the surface of the painting until we are staring at these tiny, tiny, tiny little dots that make up the face of the girl in white in the center of the painting. And it was one of those first times where I actually got to see this kind of painting, this type of painting up close. And it explored the idea of what is called optical color mixing, which explores the phenomenon that happens when small areas of color, like these dots that you see in this detail of our painting, are placed side by side. If the areas are small enough and you get enough distance from them, the eye will mix them for you. As an artist, if you wanted to make a green and you were trying to use optical color mixing, you might group a whole bunch of yellow dots next to blue dots so that when you back away, your eye mixes them for you and makes a green. So Seurat is playing with this on this kind of like almost microscopic level with tiny little dots. We call this technique today pointillism. He called it divisionism. But we call it pointillism today because of those tiny little dots, right? Let's look at a few more details. One of the things that fascinates me the most about optical color mixing and Seurat's pointillism is how many colors might be invested in something like a skin tone. If you look at this hand holding this bouquet, and you really look at it, you start seeing areas of green, blue, purple, orange, red, a few little hits of white here and there. But all these colors together in different combinations, when you back away, creates the look of kind of a flesh tone in shadow. If you look at the grass, you can see how many different shades of yellow, green, and blue there are. And it just shows you how infinitesimally small some of these dots are. There must be millions and millions on the surface of this huge painting. And one effect that the dots have is that there are clear, crisp contours on the outside edge of these subjects, like you see here on the skirt of the woman in red or the umbrella of the seated woman. But you also don't have detail. It's soft, like the face of the little girl. We know she has a face. We can see an indicator of where her eyes are. Her lips are slightly red. And we even see a tiny little highlight where her nose is. But there is no detail, right? It's all these tiny little dots. So it's both crisp and fuzzy. And part of that is because those little dots are supposed to combine, right? Our eye is supposed to make things harder edged. Our eye resolves it for us. And so no wonder it took years and years to make. Seurat tested these color theories again and again before beginning his great painting. And then while he was painting it, he made all these minute adjustments all the time. This was a very painstaking, methodical, analytical process of painting, which was totally at odds with the spontaneous, painterly techniques used by the Impressionists. Here's another detail. I also wanted to show you this image because you can see that sometimes he will lengthen those points to lines, like in the skirt, and that those lines sometimes conform to the contour of the object, making it look like they follow the form of the object. We can see the cheek of the monkey kind of has these arcs and how he arranged the lines, or the skirt flares out on the hem. And so sometimes he didn't make all the dots identical, and sometimes those textural differences are really important. But there's still a mixture of colors. Look at all the colors we see just on that dress alone. It's hard to tell what the original color of the dress is because she's sitting in shade and it affects everything. We can see all those little colors. Like I said, the details aren't crisp. We don't really see an eye on this woman. We see a collection of dots that implies an eye, or a collection of dots that implies her lips. And even the contour of her face sometimes just dissolves into the man's face behind her. So it's not always crisp. These little points are very different than the kind of brushwork we see from the other Impressionists, which is another thing that made this painting stand out as kind of different. Let's look at this. This is a detail of Claude Monet's brushworks from one of his water lily paintings, and we can compare it next to this detail of Seurat's pointillism. And we see Monet's are longer, they look more lively and spontaneous, they flicker, and there's kind of this energy to how they're applied, looseness. When we look at Seurat's and we see a methodical dot, dot, dot. And the way of working was not spontaneous at all. It's methodical. It's process-oriented. It's not about capturing the flickering of light. It's about capturing a color balance by scientific application and minute study. And so this approach to painting is one of the things that made it stand out. His approach to painting wasn't the only thing that was different. It was his thinking about it as well. This is one of the famous quotes that he has said about this work of his. He said that, "Some say they see poetry in my paintings. I see only science." That shows that he thinks of himself maybe almost as much of a color scientist as he is an artist. And that's quite different from how the other artists thought of their work. At the age of 26, Seurat debuted this great masterpiece of his with the Impressionists at the 8th and final Impressionist exhibit in 1886. He called this new style Neo-Impressionism, and his huge canvas drew huge crowds. Wasn't always good, though. The attention it got wasn't always positive. It was so different from the prevailing Impressionist style that a lot of people didn't really like it. In fact, the artists that he showed with were divided. Some defended his work and applauded his, great scale and his color theory. But others didn't love that it wasn't spontaneous. Seurat wasn't after spontaneity. He was actually after stillness. He compared what he was trying to do to the frieze of the Parthenon, this kind of grand, still, Greek, history type of piece. But he also wanted to capture modern subjects. So we have here something in common with the Impressionists, who were also trying to paint the modern world. Seurat just does it in a very quiet, very methodical way, instead of spontaneous and lively. This style might have been very different from the Impressionists, but the subject is right up their alley. He wanted to paint modern life too. So he would endlessly rearrange his cast of characters. He would rearrange these groupings until he ended up with these final 48 figures, 3 dogs and 1 monkey. And we really can appreciate what it took to pull off such a complex image, the harmony he's able to create, and the color science he is exploring. Take a closer look at that border. 2 years after he exhibited this painting, he would re-stretch it and paint this border on there. And if you look closely around the edges of the painting, for instance, on the right-hand side, in that lower corner where it's all green grass, the border is mostly red. And if you move up to about midway, you see this little orange or red triangle that intrudes from that outside edge. And you can see that the border changes colors to blue. He understood complementary colors and wanted to create a contrast, a simultaneous contrast. When you put red next to green, both appear more vibrant. So by surrounding his green grass by a red border, makes the green look more luminous and intense. And by putting blue next to oranges, it does the same thing. So he wasn't done working on the color theory even years after he showed it, right? He even dictated that this painting have a white frame around it, because that's how he wanted it to be viewed. So we're looking at this scene of leisure, and it came from a popular leisure spot. La Grande Jatte is an island in the middle of the Seine River. And if you look at the map, you can see a little pinpoint, kind of on just to the northwest of the center of Paris. And it was this thin little strip of island in a northern suburb that was pretty industrial when he was there. And it was a popular spot for people to go and gather. Here it is today, next to Seurat's painting of it. And so this was a really popular spot for people to come gather on Sundays. Why Sundays? What was so important about that? Well, Sundays were special days for Parisians. They would go get dressed up, go to church, and then they would gather in spots like this in parks and dance halls and restaurants to visit with one another and to relax and enjoy themselves. The paintings show a beloved Parisian tradition, a popular subject amongst the Impressionists. Of course, the styles differ, but the subject's the same. This painting by Pierre-Auguste Renoir is called La Grenière, and it was the nickname of it. It's called like the Frog Pond is the translation. And this tiny little island was next to it. This is called the Camembert. This tiny little round island with one single tree shows a group of people huddling under it for shade and people enjoying the water, right? One of those common Sunday activities. Another popular spot that the Impressionists often captured for their leisure was the area of Argenteuil. This is the bridge at Argenteuil, and they would go here because they could do boating. It was a place where the Seine River widened, and they would have like boat races and things like that. And it was a popular spot for Claude Monet and Auguste Renoir, and they would go paint there together. This is another famous image of people getting together and relaxing, Luncheon of the Boating Party by Renoir. And we see, again, people having a good time, people at leisure, modern people, Parisians. They would gather in parks and even dance halls. This is one of Renoir's most famous paintings, the dance at the Moulin de la Galette. This dance hall was at a windmill, and it was a spot that was converted into, like I said, a kind of a dance club and a place where you could get together, have fun, and enjoy yourselves. So it was a really popular spot. And Renoir, Monet, and Seurat, and all of the other people of that era were trying to capture modern life. Thank you for joining me today on Art Fridge Art History. I hope if you enjoyed this video that you'll tell all your friends and hit that subscribe button. See you next time.